Hello and welcome to another edition of Ask the Pastor. This week's question comes to us from Ron Davis, and it's a follow-up question from the last Ask the Pastor segment I did regarding Matthew's chapters 24 and 25. Ron Davis asked this: after reading Matthew chapter 24 and 25, I have another question. What does Jesus mean in Matthew chapter 24 verse 22 when he says, and if those days had not been shortened, no human being would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Well, there are three distinct things that we need to examine in order to understand exactly what Jesus is saying here. First, we need to understand the context of the address. Jesus gives this secret teaching. It's called his fifth or final discourse to his disciples during his time in Jerusalem when he is facing the pain of his crucifixion. He comes into Jerusalem, of course, we remember this from Palm Sunday, and he is lauded by the crowds. He cleanses the temple, and then the next day he returns to the temple and begins to teach. After his teaching of the people in the temple, his disciples are absolutely enamored with the city. And Jesus says to them, something will happen. Not one stone will be left standing one another in this great city. And then he leads them out across the valley to the Mount of Olives, where he teaches these two chapters with the great city on the hill as a bit of a backdrop. Now, if you want to fully understand those chapters, there's a lot of good biblical commentary out there. But if you want kind of a thumbnail sketch of what happens there, you can refer to my earlier Ask the Pastor segment, and I have included a link to that in the description below. So if you want to refresh that, you can just go down into the description, click on the link, and it will take you to that video. Now, the second thing that we need to know about the 22nd verse of this 24th chapter is that it's actually borrowed from another book, a book that is no longer in Scripture. Many of your annotated Bibles might have a little symbol, and then you go down into the bottom of the text and you read, and they will reference the 80th chapter, first verse of this book called Enoch, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And finally, this verse sounds extremely cryptic and mysterious to us, largely in part due to the fact that it is an ancient idiomatic expression, and I'll unpack that in a few minutes. But first I want to go back to the fact that this verse is borrowed in a sense from another ancient book. And like I said, it's borrowed from the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is a book that was written 4 centuries before Jesus was born, and it has been changed and amended in those successive years. It's been expanded upon, and it's a book that talks about the fall of the Watchers or the fall of the angels. It later becomes a source for some English epic poetry, and that's largely where we get our saga of Satan's fall from grace, or in the point of the poem, it was actually Lucifer. Now, this book, like I said, even though it is 400 years old and it was produced by a Jewish community, it is an apocalypse. That is literally a revealing. It's a vision of the fulfillment of God's history. Now, currently, there are only 3 faith communities that believe the Book of Enoch to be canonical, that is, inspired scriptures. There's the Beta Israel community in Ethiopia that considers it to be scriptural or canonical. And then there are 2 Orthodox Tawahedo communities, both the Ethiopian and the Eritrean Orthodox Tawahedo communities that consider it to be part of the Bible or Scripture. It is a fascinating text, so much so that I've also included a a link below in the description if you wish to read it in its totality. So the 80th chapter begins with these words. And in the days of the sinners, the years shall be shortened. Now, as I said, most biblical texts, especially if it's an annotated or study Bible, will include that in the footnote to tell you where it comes from. And it shows that Scripture interprets Scripture. In fact, for people of faith, Scripture becomes the language of faith. And so we see bits and pieces of it popping up all over. Certainly other parts of Scripture pop up all over in the Gospels. Jesus quotes Scripture. St. Paul, likewise, weaves Scripture and scriptural theme into his letters or epistles. So this is part of Scripture interpreting Scripture as the language of faith. So Matthew 24:22 is spoken by Jesus and retold here by Matthew, has ancient roots in an apocalyptic or revealing text that is quite at home here in the 24th and 25th chapter with Jesus' secret teaching to his disciples. Okay, so then we get to our final point. Well, what does it really mean? Well, like I said, it's an idiomatic expression that's at least 2,400 years old. And an idiomatic expression is a series or grouping of words that make no sense when they're put together independent of a cultural context. They're almost impossible to translate. For instance, if we tell someone from another culture or try to translate this into another language, it's raining cats and dogs, people won't understand us. That's part of our cultural tradition. It's an idiom. Those words don't make sense to other people. But if we tell them we're experiencing a tremendous downpour of rain, then they'll understand us. Now here's where the challenge comes for biblical translators. Most versions of the Bible are actually translated by committee. And the committees begin by setting parameters, special operating procedures or standard operating procedures and guidelines for how they will approach the task of translation. Most, not all, but most biblical committees that do the translation work try to cleave as closely to the original language of the text as possible, and they leave those idioms in place. There are two translations of the Bible, though, that are quite different. The Jerusalem Bible and Good News for Modern Man, if you remember that text from the 1970s and 1980s. Those texts were written in such a way so that they would cleave not as closely to the text, but rather they were an attempt to translate the fullness of the meaning of the text into a modern way of speaking, so that they're easier to understand, and so they might translate those idioms differently. So let me show you how this works, and I'll use German as an example. For instance, if my wife asks me, would you like to have lunch before you mow the lawn or after you mow the lawn? Auf Deutsch, in German, I could say, es ist mir alles Wurst. Okay? And now if you translate that closely and cleave to the words, it means literally, it's all sausage to me. Now, that's abject gibberish to most Americans. They wouldn't understand that. What that idiom really means, and if we would translate it to try to get the full spirit of what I was trying there, would be to say, like, it really doesn't matter. It's all the same to me. We could eat now or we could eat later, whatever you want to do. Likewise, Matthew 24:22, being hard to translate, it means that, here, let me open the text and read it. And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. That's quite a literal translation of that idiom. Here's what it means. It means that even in the midst of calamity and crisis and horror, nevertheless, God still holds the cards. And so, the text really means that God is the strength of those who persevere. So that's what that means when Jesus is talking about all of these wars and bloodshed and calamity that human beings will incur throughout the ages. This verse, 22nd verse, essentially says, and yet God is the strength of those who persevere. So I hope this helps. If you have any other questions, like I said, please call me, text me, email me, get in touch with me, and I'll put together an Ask the Pastor video segment. Thank you.